Okay, John chapter 8. This is a remarkable chapter. First of all, the thing that strikes me about this, in the beginning, the chapter opens, it's like bookends. The chapter opens with a woman taken in the act of adultery, and they want to stone her. The chapter closes after Jesus is through talking with them. They want to stone Jesus. So first they're going to stone a woman taken in adultery. Then by the time they hear what Jesus got to say, they're ready to stone him as well. But let's talk about this woman taken in adultery in chapter 8 in the very beginning, because this is really interesting. A lot of interesting thoughts here. They bring to him a woman taken in adultery, and so verse 5 says, Moses in the law commands us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? Now what they said is true. Now there's no question, nobody doubts and nobody questions the fact that she was really guilty. And she doesn't deny it, and there's no evidence that this was anything other than what it's presented as. So she was really guilty, and what they said is true. According to the law of Moses, she was guilty, and she deserved to be stoned to death. The penalty for breaking the law is death. And so she was guilty, and she deserved punishment and deserved death. And what they said is true. But then they said, what do you say? This is a very important point, because if Moses and what he has to say in the law is the beginning and end of our relationship with God, then there's no need for Jesus. There's no need for Jesus to come into the picture if everything is contained in what Moses had to say in the law. In other words, if we could relate to God successfully through Moses and the law, we don't need a Savior, we don't need Jesus. So they come to him and they tell him what Moses says in the law, which is true. But then they say, what do you say? And this is interesting and important, because Jesus comes into the picture not to destroy Moses, not to destroy the law, but to bring a higher way of thinking than was available under the law. Because she was guilty and she deserved death. Let's read what Jesus said. Verse 6. This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. Sometimes when we're reading the Gospels, it pays to stop and pay attention to things that Jesus does that are peculiar or unusual. You remember in previous chapters he did some things that were a little bit unusual. Sometimes when you stop and look at the things that he does that are unusual, you find some interesting insights. The text doesn't tell us why he wrote on the ground. It doesn't tell us what he wrote on the ground. It just says that he did. It said, notice what the wording is. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. And I think this is a little bit, I don't know, it stirs my curiosity. It makes me wonder, why did he do that? I like, have you ever seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ? There's a really beautiful scene in that. The movie, The Passion of the Christ, is taken up with the death and resurrection of Jesus, mostly the crucifixion of Jesus. But there are some flashbacks where he remembers back to times in his ministry. And one of the flashbacks in that movie is this scene here. And the way Mel Gibson portrayed it, when Jesus wrote with his finger in the ground, they were all ready to stone the woman, and Jesus stands by the woman and draws a line in the sand, like saying, she's on my side. If you're going to stone her, you have to stone me too. I thought that was really beautiful. But the text doesn't really tell us that. But when I read this, when I see that it says Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground, it reminds me, see that expression, that wording reminds me of other things I've read in the Bible. Anton, if you could you give me, put on the screen Exodus 31:40 just for a second. Exodus 31:40. This is what it reminded me of as I was reading. Actually, just this morning, this caught my attention as I was reading this again. Exodus 31:40. This is after God has given the law to Moses, and they've been quoting from the law. And notice what it says about the law here in Exodus 31:40. 40. Is that right? Is that not? Did I get the wrong reference? Not that many verses? No. Oh, maybe I wrote it down wrong. Well, hold on. I'll find it for you. Just a second. Maybe I looked at. Okay, Exodus 30. Oh, there aren't that many verses. Huh. Well, okay. Let's see. 18. I don't know why I said 40. I wrote it down wrong. 18 is what I want. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone. Listen what it says, written with the finger of God. Now this expression, talking about the law, written with the finger of God, it reminds me of what we read in John chapter 8. Now go back again, Anton, to John chapter 8, and I've got the right verse this time, verse 6, because I'm looking right at it. John chapter 8, verse 6. Notice that Jesus, when he was confronted with the people who said, this woman is guilty, and Moses in the law commanded that such should be stoned. Jesus stoops down, and with his finger, notice what he's doing, writing on the ground. Now, this just makes me think. First of all, when I read with his finger wrote on the ground, it reminded me that God, in the law, the tables of stone were written, the expression is with the finger of God. Jesus is now stooping down, writing on the ground. I don't think he's making a new law, making more laws. It's as though when he says in the ground, that reminds me of something too. Do you remember in the book of Genesis how man was first created? Out of the dust of the earth and out of the ground, and man was created. It makes me think, it reminds me of the fact that man was created in the beginning, the fallen man, Adam, who fell through disobedience to God, and whose descendants were given the law of God written with the finger of God. Jesus stooping down, writing in the ground. It creates the idea in my mind that perhaps what he's doing here is illustrating the fact that the solution to this problem is not more laws, but a new creation. Perhaps. That's what makes me think. So perhaps Jesus symbolically is saying, to solve this dilemma here, it's going to be necessary for me to make available a new creation, which is exactly what he does. But anyway, that's my take on it. Let's go on reading. Verse 7. So when they continued asking him, he lifted himself up, and he says, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone. And then he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in her midst. Now, it's interesting that they brought a woman who was guilty, and no doubt about it, and she was certainly guilty. And Jesus doesn't deny that she's also guilty, and doesn't deny that she deserves to be stoned. In fact, what he says is, he that's without sin among you, let him first cast a stone. In other words, she's guilty and she deserves punishment, all right. But what he says brings home the point that not only was she guilty, but all of those people who accused her were also guilty. That's the point he made. And that's the point that got across to them. And that's why, one by one, I think it's interesting, this is beginning with the eldest, the people who had been around the longest and who knew more than the others that it was really true. They all left one by one. So they all knew that what he said was true. And the point he's saying, without directly saying it, is that yes, she's guilty, but guess what? You're also guilty. She's guilty, and you're guilty. In fact, the only person in this scene who had the right to throw stones at her was Jesus. The only one without sin is Jesus. Notice that? And he refused to execute punishment. He refused to pass the sentence and to condemn her. Jesus reveals to us here the outcome in the end, or the real message of the law, which is not just a woman taken in adultery is guilty, but everybody's guilty in some form or fashion. And if that were not true, please consider this, if that were not true, then we don't need Jesus. If it were possible to relate to God by being good enough, then we don't need a Savior. But it's not possible. Because no matter who you are, you might be better than the woman taken with adultery. You might be better than the person next to you, but you're not as good as God. So if you're going to relate to God based on your own goodness, you've got to be as good as God. Now, not many people will stand up and say, that's me, I'm as good as God. What most people will say is, I may not be perfect, but at least I don't do what they do.